Thank you very much to the Political Economy Research Group for inviting me and to Speak for setting everything up with my visit. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been trying to come for at least 3 years, and for various reasons it's never worked out. So I'm happy to come now, and I will talk about the book that you just mentioned. I'll actually send it around so you can look at it. But I will give you a brief summary of what this book is about and why I wrote it. And to start, the basic question is, I was like everybody else reading the newspaper in the midst of the financial crisis, and I was very amazed with these huge government interventions in favor of the banking industry, because a lot of people wouldn't have thought that this was possible. At least the amounts were so huge that some people asked, where did the money come from, and also why did governments all across the board decide to engage in bailing out their banks. And actually, the very first study I did was with a co-author, Emiliano Grossman, and he came to me and he said, why don't we study bailouts? It's a fantastic case for social scientists who have these public policies happening everywhere at exactly the same time, and we have data on everything that happens. So we have data for every single country on how much these bailouts cost and what they were designed to do. And I said, wow, coincidence of timing and big data, this is perfect. Let's do an article. It'll last a month, and we will publish it and become rich and famous. And of course, it always takes much longer. I will tell you at length something about the problems we had with the data that was indeed available, but that's quite problematic, and how I then decided to turn this into a book. But the main idea was this: why did bailouts happen? Also because in this initial study, we decided to look at countries that bailed out their banks and countries that didn't bail out their banks, and explain who decided to go save the banks and who didn't. The problem is that nobody decided not to save their banks, we realized afterwards. So we only could focus on how did governments design the safety measures that they put into place in the different cases, because bailouts are pretty much a fact of life in every advanced industrial economy that had a financialized sector. But the question is, how could this happen? And the answer that you can read just about anywhere is, it's because of the big banks. And I have so my research has always been focused on business lobbying, and I figured, okay, this seems to be the most outrageous case of business lobbying, where businesses basically come to the government, hold out their hand and say, save us now, please, even if it costs the taxpayer an outrageous amount of money, and I would like to see how this is possible, how this can happen. What's the influence that financial institutions really have over their government? And in a way, I thought this was important because people who try to understand bailouts a lot of times come at it from an economic perspective, and they ask, what drives the government in saving their banks, given that this creates enormous amount of moral hazard? So you have the traditional classical economists saying a government should never save their banks because there's no way of having credible market mechanisms. If this happens, there is an advantage to the banks who are getting saved, so you're creating moral hazard problem. So basically the government is just wrong in doing it in any configuration whatsoever. And the other argument, which is also more from an economics perspective, is no, you don't understand. Governments need to come in and save their banks because there is such a thing as systemic risk. And if we let some of these institutions go under, the contagion effect will be so huge that the entire economy will collapse. So even though this might seem like it's expensive, it's actually much less expensive than having to build the economy back up once it has collapsed. So this is the discussion you hear about bailouts. And I was unsatisfied with it because it only considers what was going on in the minds of the policymakers that decided to put up very big guarantees or recapitalize their financial industries. So what I do in this book is I turn the question around, and I ask not what is going on in the minds of the policymakers, but what's going on in the minds of the financial industry. First and foremost, because there's this idea that the financial industry actually went to the government and asked for help, but also because for me the puzzle is not why the government saved the banks, but why the banks did not save each other. So why did the financial industry not do anything to avoid the failure of one of their individual members or one of their competitors, if you will? Maybe the answer is obvious, but I didn't think it was quite obvious. And the underlying argument is that if we want to understand what the government did in order to save the banking sector, we need to understand what the banking sector did and how the banking sector interacted with the government. And I ask this in particular because for the governments, actually getting the banking sector involved and getting the banking sector collectively to support one another was one of the primary goals in all the negotiations leading up to the bank bailouts. Governments almost everywhere gathered their industry in a room at one point or another and said, come up with a proposal to how you can stop this. So my question really is, when did this work? When did this not work? And I will show you cases where it worked, where the banking industry came in and did something, and in other cases where the banking industry failed to come forward, and then it was just the government supporting them financially and kind of unilaterally. And I do this, and that's the objective of the book, by studying business-government relations during the crisis in 6 countries. I will argue why these 6 countries. I look at the United States and the United Kingdom, France and Germany, and Ireland and Denmark. So the presentation today will first tell you the theoretical argument that I'm developing, which is in relation to the political science literature in particular. I will tell you how the research was designed, what explains the case studies, and what we know from these cases by just superficially looking at bank bailouts. I will discuss the variety of bailout arrangements that you can see in these 6 countries, and here's where you should kind of waver when you become uneasy, and I'm going on for too long because I can talk about this quite some time. And then I will say something about success and failure, which are, as you probably know, not very comfortable terms for political scientists, but I would like to say something about what is a good and what's a bad bailout, in my opinion. So theory. The theoretical argument of this book is really on a concept that I would advise you all not to study because everybody's already worked on it for so long. It's on power. And in particular, I'm interested in the business-government relations because I'm interested in understanding what exactly is the power relationship, something as huge and central as the financial industry can have with the government, because it seemed for many that the moment in which bailouts happened was basically a moment, or the bailouts were a demonstration of the weakness of government. So the idea of weakness and power over somebody was something that drove me initially. And this is also the case because in the course of reading, it comes up all the time that the financial industry imposed itself, got the government to do things that the government didn't want to, and you all know from Dahl that that is an exercise of power. As a student of a scholar on lobbying, I was very struck that the financial crisis did something very strange to the profession of economics. They all of a sudden all started focusing on politics, even though previously they hadn't written very much about it. There's the most influential books on the financial crisis are books such as Simon Johnson's book co-authored with James Kwok on 13 Bankers, it's called, and I think the subtitle is How Wall Street Took Over Politics. There's other writings as well on lobbying. I forget the authors, it's 4 of them, wrote a piece on lobbying during the financial called A Fistful of Dollars, where they basically now study lobbying, study political connections in order to explain this malfunctioning of markets that somehow didn't have a place in the explanations they developed previously. And this writing was very influential and also intuitively very compelling, but it relied on a very simple notion of lobbying. So for a political scientist, it was almost crude, but it did defend this idea that something as wrong as bailouts could only be explained by the undue influence of the lobbyists of the financial industry, which have some sort of good to offer to the governments that they exchange in response to, they exchange in return the government gives them either regulation that's favorable or in this case the bailout. And this type of exchange interaction is often summarized as instrumental power. Other perspectives that were very prominent, not as an argument about power, but I will make it into one, was that the nature of bailouts depended really on the structure of the socio-economies in question. So each country, this is the varieties of capitalism idea, The people who formulate it are not necessarily scholars in comparative political economy, but the argument is you save your banks if you have a bank-based economy because the banks are so crucial. If you have a capital market-based economy, banks in and of themselves may not be, so you have a very different perspective on this. So there's an underlying argument that institutions matter, institutional difference matters, and the role of banks in the economy are probably the most important factor that can help us explain what power banks and the financial sector can have over their governments. And I call this an institutional perspective, but it relates to the notion of structural power. At one point, the financial industry takes on a role, and this role determines how dependent governments are on them and will determine how they will act in response to it. And then a final idea that is also quite well established now is the idea that power of the financial industry goes through cognitive influence. Again, even economists now publish books on cognitive capture. If you've all studied capture before, capture is outdated, now it's cognitive capture, which means you have to have some mechanism through which the financial industry and supporters of finance construct a mindset in favor of finance, even on the side of the policymakers. And this mindset goes through all sorts of strange things, like defining what liquidity means, defining what moral hazard is, defining what a limited liability, what limited liability means in companies, et cetera, et cetera. And it also goes through lobbying that's more ideas-based. And you had, for example, Anand Adnati and Martin Hellwig publish a book, The Banker's New Clothes, which are like in the German-Danish fairy tale. The bankers are naked and think they have clothes, but they tell everybody they have clothes, whereas they're really naked, and that's the same with capital requirements. I don't know if you get the link, but they say they have capital requirements that are sufficient, and whereas they really don't. Anyway, the argument here is that that there is something in the way people think about finance that helps us to explain why and how we save them. My argument is that all of these perspectives, nothing is entirely wrong with them. All of this happens a little bit, but they don't help us to explain bailout arrangements. Lobbying doesn't help us to explain bailout arrangements. That's the one I wipe off the table most quickly, because in all countries, governments did things even when there was very little lobbying. And sometimes I overstate this case by saying, in my opinion, all of the bankers that were important could have gone off to an island and basically drink tea. They would have still been bailed out by their governments. So the actual interaction at the moment of the crisis is of very little explanatory influence. Now, the institutional differences seem to play an important role to me, and I designed the entire research design around this hypothesis in order to test it. And I come to the conclusion that the institutional differences matter, but not enough to explain the real qualitative difference of bailout designs across countries. And the cognitive influence matters, but is so diffuse that it doesn't help us to understand precise actions at any one moment in time either. So what I instead propose is, this is a initial reflection, is to think about the interests of the financial industry in this business-government relations, and to first understand that preventing the failure of systematically relevant institutions, this is the argument of the systemic risk literature, is not only in the interest of the government, but it's also in the interest of the financial sector together. You obviously don't want the economy to collapse if you're an actor in the economy. And what we can, what this leads us to is that the exercise of power, and a lot of the power literature has already argued that focusing on just the exercise of power is misleading. So I joined this literature on non-decisions, for example, and I say the exercise of power should not be measured by what the financial industry does to influence bailout, that's the lobbying perspective, but what they did not do. And that's important because they have a very strong interest in action. They want to avoid the collapse. So they have an interest in action. If they then don't get active in order to support it, that's an exercise of power. And that's what I call the power of collective inaction. If a financial industry has the capacity to remain collectively inactive in this intense moment of crisis, it's a very strong indicator that we have a biased business-government relation, and it's an exercise of power just to the same degree as it would be if I had actually been taking a photograph of them putting a suitcase full of money in front of a government representative. And that argument is based on the idea that, of course, there is structural power of the banking industry. I don't say there is no structural power. On the contrary, it is evident that finance has a hugely important role in the economy and has very high structural power. Because of this high structural power and because of this crisis situation where action was needed, the non-action is an indicator that is quite central and that I think we have so far neglected in studying bailouts, or at least the economists that write on this have not been quite aware of. So how do I go about doing the research in this argument? So the understanding that comes from even people working in the field is that the role of the banks in the economy matter. And as I mentioned, bank-based systems, comparing them with capital market systems is relevant. So first I said, okay, what are bank-based systems and what are capital market systems? I don't know how many of you have looked at this, but basically let me summarize the literature. We just don't know quite well. We know it when we see it. If you study an individual case, you'll probably make an argument over which one is which, but there's a lot of indicators and none is the established indicator for the distinction. So what I did is I looked at two types of activities which are usually contained in the data sets that are trying to establish this distinction. One is a stock market activity. That's the axis. Let me see. Can I do this? Yes. That's this axis. And one is the activity, the volume and the transaction by private banks. That's this activity. And basically, if you have a majority of activities, if you're under the blue line distinguishes the two systems. If you're over here, then the activities of banks are more important than the activities of stock markets, comparatively speaking. And if you're on top of this line, then you have a lot of capital market activities. And I think it's useful to cross the two lines because you will see cases like the UK and the US, which have, we always think about them as capital market systems, but they also have huge amounts of bank activities down here. It's just that they're somehow in a different universe from the traditional ones that we consider bank-based systems. So both of them are important. And what I basically tried to find is cases that grouped. And thankfully they're grouped in a way that logically I would think about them as well from the varieties of capitalism literature. So the UK and the US are similar in the sustained importance of both banks and capital markets, but the role of capital markets is more important. You have cases here, and the ones I looked at are Denmark and Ireland, which are close together. That's actually just an accident, but it allowed me to do a third circle, so that's nice because I chose them for another reason as well. And France, Italy, and Germany are also somehow less active, but still have a lot of less active than the US and the UK. But they have more activities, and they have a lot of bank-based activities than some other countries. So I compare the UK, the US, France, Germany, Ireland, and Denmark in order to test what exactly the structural power, the institutional differences can help to explain. Had I found results that are basically this kind of bailout is different from this kind of bailout, is different from this kind of bailout, it would have confirmed the hypothesis that institutional differences explain government action or industry action. Let me just mention the Danish-Irish comparison for me was not so much about whether they're bank-based or capital market-based. It's because I consider that they're a specific kind of structural power of the financial industry because they're small, open economies. They are very small economies depending on their international market necessarily, and the financial sector has a very important portion of the activities that are not within Ireland or Denmark, but that are actually on the international market. And that creates very intense pressures at a moment where there's an international financial crisis. So the comparison here is really a small open economy comparison. But before I go into the findings, let me just tell you what there is to know about bailouts, at least from my perspective, in all of these different countries. So the data I project, I don't think it's on every slide, is mainly data from the European Commission. Eurostat has done a considerable effort to publish somehow, let's say, harmonized declarations of bailout expenditures. But let me also mention that why I've never done really a quantitative study on this like we initially envisioned when I started on the project with Emiliano Grossman. The politics of declaring how much you spend on the banks are in and of themselves an entirely obscure exercise that is obviously of very high political importance. Nobody likes to admit that they spend a lot of money, and what exactly you spend will move from categories, will be defined in different ways. So initially, for example, in the European data, you find 4 categories, and one is called liquidity support. sounds pretty basic. I've asked a lot of people working in senior positions in central banks what liquidity support is, because usually liquidity support refers to monetary policy from the central banks, which puts in liquidity. But this liquidity support is liquidity support that does not include central bank activities. So what kind of liquidity support do we have by basically treasury departments? I didn't know. No central banker could explain it to me. They thought, well, in a way, all bank bailouts are liquidity support. If you recapitalize them, it will help them raise liquidity. So they didn't understand this distinction. Okay, so that just means I didn't understand the category. That's not so much of an issue. But also the amounts that were declared were sometimes not questionable, but you see very different numbers depending on who they had to declare it to. There's an IMF data set, for example. It doesn't reflect at all the same numbers that Eurostat have. There's independent in the US, for example. There's a lot of independent regulators. There's some NGOs. They collect money. None of the numbers are exactly the same. You just get a ballpark order of very expensive, somewhat expensive, not very expensive. So that put me at an unease. And then there was a moment in German politics where Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble went on television and said, we've actually spent 50 billion less on our bailout than we thought. There was a little accounting error, so we've corrected it, so we're 50 billion richer. And the accounting error was that the consultants who had established the numbers had actually put the assets and the liabilities of one of the big failing banks in one category, whereas they would have had to divide it up. But that basically just political apology. Sorry, we weren't as exuberant as we thought. 50 billion are back in the German budget. And I'm thinking, wow, what do you do with the data set where you have a 50 billion variation depending on who just discovered the accounting error? So all the numbers I will show you are numbers that should tell you general trends, but please don't trust them entirely, not because you don't trust me, but because these numbers are so political that I have doubts about how valid they are. And also, final thing, they're not finished. These are moving, this is living organisms. So bank bailouts still continue to either have income because of dividends paid or other types of fees, and some still continue to accumulate losses, and there is no real way of saying what will happen in the end. So there's a bailout of a French bank in, oh God, my numbers, Crédit Lyonnais in the early 90s. Somebody knows it, scream it, 94 or something. And the books were just closed a year and a half ago. And the outcome was it was a huge loss to the taxpayer, but so you probably need 10, 15 years to know the real costs of these bailouts. Okay. With all of these disclaimers, here are the numbers. These are according to the European Committee, so Eurostat and a comparable US data set, the committed versus actual expenditures. So committed expenditures is money that is made available by the government and most often also been passed by parliament. So this is something that governments declared would be available to the financial sector if need be. And then actual expenditures are the expenditures of what then is really spent or has been called upon. And the dark column is what's being called upon. First thing to notice is that everybody is somewhere in this world where in extreme cases like the UK, up to 50% of GDP was made available. The same in the Netherlands, the same in Greece, Sweden, down to something around 24%. And then what was actually, the actual expenditures hover around, in high cases, 20% of GDP, in low cases, 6%. But those are the general regions. Except for, and this is why I study them, Ireland and Denmark. Is anybody here Irish? Okay, because I mince my words a lot more when I talk to an Irish audience. The Irish bailout was just a tragedy, and people feel still really vivid about it. For me as a social scientist, it's an instructive strategy, because basically what happened in Ireland should have happened in Denmark as well, and it didn't. Ireland and Denmark committed so Ireland 327% of their GDP, and Denmark 256% of their GDP. So when I had these numbers first, Ireland was not yet in a sovereign debt crisis, and I looked at this and I wondered, how can you commit three times your GDP? How can you commit money that you don't have? Well, they did, and in the end it was called upon and the country went bankrupt. Had I written a blog article about this, I would be famous now, but I was just sitting at this, I'm like, how is this possible? Okay, Now, Denmark did the same. Denmark did exactly the same. They committed an amount of money that would have ruined the country had it been called upon. But the main difference is that in Ireland, 270% were actual expenditures, and in Denmark, it was only 67%. And 67% was manageable. So the most important puzzle for me from this data set is what explains the difference between Denmark and Ireland. And I will get to that. In terms of total expenditures, because GDP obviously tells you something more visible about small countries, you did have one of the most important bailouts in the United States, as you can see over here, but Ireland comes in second. So the United Kingdom third. Ireland is the most important bailout, even somewhere sandwiched between the United States and the United Kingdom, and then come countries like Germany, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, and Spain. The Netherlands had quite an important bailout, but it wasn't a national program. It was a bank-by-bank type of bailout, and I was interested in government policy, so I wanted to study what happened when it was a comprehensive bailout package. And the other countries are all smaller in terms of absolute numbers. You can also see, but this is less important for my discussion, what the money was spent on. You can spend it on guarantees. You can spend it on recapitalization, so this is actually equity bought in the companies, or on asset reliefs, the famous toxic assets, or on this category called liquidity, which I still don't know what it is. Okay, now those are the costs, but just because you spend a lot on your bailout doesn't mean you lose a lot. And does anybody know how the US is doing on their bailout today? In a general sense, did it go well, did it go poorly? Went well, yes. So nobody communicates about this ever. If you don't know, it's not because you don't read the newspaper, it's because it's hard information to come by. Because the word bailout has such a negative connotation that even if you make money with your bailout, you won't go on television saying it. But the US, it looks like they made at least something like 20 billion off of their bailouts. It was quite a successful investment, if I can say it this way, because they bought equity with a system where they would actually get a lot of returns if the value of the company goes up, and the US went out of recession, is doing quite well now. And so they get quite considerable amount of money back in a way that even erases the losses they make in some of the parts of their bailout, like the automobile industry. So, okay, so the US went well. This is now, the numbers here are the snapshot stops in 2011. This is a picture, so this should actually be a long list, but then it's illegible. On this side, you have countries which made money with their bailout, and on this side, you have countries which lost money with their bailout. And the United States will move over here now, but you can already see it's only 0.004% of their GDP, even then, and today it's a positive number. So the country that made most out of their bailout is France. Then comes Spain. Now, that's because I did the snapshot in 2011. I think Spain would be in a different spot now. And then comes Denmark. Denmark also had a positive return on their bailout. Then come a couple of other countries. No, Hungary is here. Yeah. And then come the countries where things went not so well, the Baltic countries, Luxembourg as well, but really the countries that are most difficult. I will say something about the United Kingdom that's a bit more upbeat than these numbers, but Germany was an expensive bailout, Ireland was a disaster, and the United States was a huge bailout, but moves the other way if we took the data from today. And even then, even with a 66 billion loss, that's not very expensive. That's exactly the question. So why do some countries make money and others don't? Now, actually, one answer is it depends on what you did with the money you invested in the country, what you did with the government money that went into the bailout. It's not the money invested in bailouts is not money given to the financial industry. It is equity that's being bought, and equity gives you dividends, or it's guarantees for which the banking industry pays fees, and then they have to pay it back. So in theory, every bailout, you give the money, which they will pay back, and on top of it, they will pay fees. However, and this is the tricky part, you will, by investing equity, also invest equity in companies that might, in the end, lose value, not be able to pay you back, and not pay you a very important, the dividend payments will be negligible because the company is doing poorly. And in the worst case scenario, you will transfer a lot of assets, such as toxic assets, which the government will hold, which continue to lose money, And so basically all the money that is lost is on the taxpayer's account and not on the banking side account. So design of bailouts actually matters, and not a lot of this will be in the discussion because it has to do with what type of equity you buy, what type of conditions you have on the fees for guarantees, etc. And some of this, for example, the United States was quite smart in the type of equity and the type of shares and the type of dividend conditions they imposed. But I will give you a general sense of choices that are being made. And I wouldn't want to design, by the way, the next world's bailout, because even though I have something to say about the politics of it, the exact type of equity you buy, you really need to be an M&A or a legal specialist to know exactly to evaluate what is in the balance sheet of a bank, what you can do with it, and what the future return on it will be. If you knew what the future return on this will be, you could price it correctly and then you wouldn't lose money. But the problem is you don't know, so you will not price it correctly, and if you've paid too much, you will lose money. If you pay too little, well, you will make money. So it's kind of like bailouts, a little bit like investing in the stock market, just a little bit. Okay, but that's somehow what I wanted to explain, except for the numbers are too unstable to really say I will explain the variation in net costs of bailouts. But I just wanted to explain the past, what helps us to explain what things went well and how things went poorly. Okay, so what are the different bailout arrangements we have? And here I'm talking about the politics of it rather than the precise decisions which do make a difference for the returns on the bailouts. And let me start backwards. In the book, I start with the US and the UK because everybody thinks that those are the most important countries where bailouts happen, and they're a nice story to tell that everybody knows, the Lehman Brothers, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately for me, they're the least telling cases for my argument. So I would like with you to build from the strongest case to the weakest one, the US and the UK. I can tell you the story, but it doesn't give me much material, but Denmark and Ireland gives me a lot of material, and it's reproduced in the French-German comparison. So I will turn the chapters around. But it's done differently in the book. So small open economies have specific problems is that they depend on international wholesale finance in order to fund themselves all the time, so you depend on international markets. And on top of this, Denmark and Ireland both had a housing market bubble of their own. We always hear about the subprime crisis, but they had their own housing market bubbles, which created a twin pressure of a crash of the housing market. And the Danish crash was actually more important than the Irish crash, which we've heard much more about. And this continued need to access international markets in order to fund themselves. Those of you that have read a lot on the financial crisis might be aware that one of the problems of financial institutions is that they almost daily need to have cash flowing in order to roll over their debt. And so if you're cut off from international markets, you have initially just a liquidity problem, but it will quickly turn into a solvency problem because you can't roll over your debt anymore, and so you're bankrupt just because this inflow isn't coming in. This is particularly pronounced in the case of Ireland and Denmark, but this was also very pronounced for a bank like Northern Rock, which was a symbol of banks going down in the UK. Now, as I just mentioned, both had very, very high initial commitments from their governments to support the banking industry. Both were very early. They were earlier than some of the bailout commitments in other countries because the pressure was so intense. But the money in the end spent is not the same. Denmark did much better than Ireland. Now, my argument builds on the role that the industry played in working with the government to obtain the bailout arrangement that was in the end put into place. Let me start with Denmark. So what do we all know about Denmark in varieties of capitalism? Denmark is this corporatist paradise where everybody works with one another, everything is negotiated, it's a negotiated economy. Well, basically this story is exactly the story I will tell you about the bank bailouts. The Danish banking industry built an institution called the Danish Contingency Association. I'm looking for the Danish name, but it doesn't come to me, and if none of you is Danish, I will just leave it in English, which was a jointly funded, so government and industry funded company for unwinding failing financial institutions. In a way, what happened in the Danish bailout is that the government had put up a guarantee by which they backed this activity, but it's the industry which ring-fenced itself by paying considerable amounts of their own funds into a collective institution, which acted as a buffer. So every time a bank needed to be unwound, it did this with basically private money, and only if the private ring fence failed did the government have to use its guarantees to come in and help as well. And the Danish case, I say, despite 9 bank failures, I actually want to say there were almost 13 or 14, but I wonder why I have different figures on my slide and in my head. In any case, a considerable amount of Danish banks actually failed. So Denmark is not a case where things went well, but the failure was handled in a way that didn't require calling upon the public funding. That was the second backstop behind the private contingency association money. And this is what explains why, in the end, Denmark didn't experience a sovereign debt crisis like it did, like Ireland did. The negotiations of the 6 consecutive bank packages in Denmark all happened very closely with the industry and the government. They basically agreed on every aspect of it, even on trying different things. Back in the day, the big discussion was to bail out or not to bail out. Today, the discussion is to bail in or not to bail in. Bailing in means you make some of your bondholders, shareholders pay. They lose part of their investment. In Denmark, for example, in Bank Package 3, this was experimented by basically saying we will let Amagerbanken and Fjordsbank Mørs go bankrupt and bail in some of the shareholders and bondholders. And it was a little experiment that was a disaster for the Danish industry, because the financial markets, as this collective psychology, just noticed, wow, Danish banks are going bankrupt, nobody is propping them up. That means Denmark is not a safe investment anymore, and all money was taken out of Denmark. So even the banks that were supposedly still doing well, even the banks that didn't have these acute problems, didn't have access to funding anymore. So the banking industry immediately ran amok and said to the government, we need to stop. We need to correct Bank Package 3, it's too extreme, let's go to Bank Package 4, Bank Package 5 and 6, etc. So there was a collective adjustment to see if the results produced by the bank package were going well or not well. And this, in the long run, was actually quite successful. In Ireland, even though Ireland is a very small country as well, and even though Ireland has a very strong connection between the political and economic elites as well, the way in which the business, the industry and the government worked together was not at all the same. First of all, there was no collective element whatsoever. There was one moment where the 2 Irish banks, Bank of Ireland and AIB, Irish Bank? I wonder what... It's not Anglo-Irish. Because Anglo-Irish was the rotten apple. I wonder... So the 2 Main Street banks that were doing well at one point went together to see the government and said that they were concerned about Anglo-Irish. That was the most collective thing that they did. They said we will even put up a funding line of providing some liquidity for Anglo-Irish, but the government didn't take them up on it, so nothing was really collective. What in the end happened was that every bank negotiated individually with the government and did so in a manner that, because there's nobody Irish in the room, I will just call as entirely corrupt and mischievous on the part of the financial industry. You can go on the website of the, I think it's the Irish Times, where there's a lot of documentary around what's called the Irish, Anglo-Irish tape scandal. Executives from Anglo-Irish were caught on tape telling exactly how the strategy they used in order to trick the government into giving them money by inventing numbers. By the way, they always use very crude language for telling this. So they invented numbers and lied to the government and said we're in a horrible situation. The government at that point wanted to help, and that was just the point, because the executives wanted them to have, as they said, skin in the game so that they couldn't draw back out, and they got more and more drawn in. So basically, the one-on-one relationships created put the government in a very weak position for the negotiations, where they were dependent on information given to them by the bank that they were negotiating with at one point in time, and that was a mistake, also because of some dishonesty. So the bailout that in the end ended up being put into place was entirely government-run. There was an agency created for asset transfer that's now entirely public, even though some of the banks are part of the construction. And the nature of the intervention was also very late, very much led in reaction to different failures along the way. So the outcome was that the country went bankrupt as well and had to be bailed out by the IMF and the European Central Bank. Now, just a word about Denmark and Ireland. So my question is, why didn't Ireland act like Denmark? They actually asked themselves this, and thankfully we have tape recordings, but one of the executives said we couldn't come up with a collective plan to save each other, because people would have said, oh, it's this Irish, what's the word? It's the Irish elites again, going to a pub and writing something on a Bierdeckel for themselves. It was already the image of the Irish industry working with the government was illegitimate and sounded like some sort of cronyism, that they didn't try to do it. Whereas in Denmark, it had a different basis for negotiation, which was quite formal, quite professionalized, and didn't sound like it was the result of a pub conversation or, as the newspaper said, a joint golf trip between the government and the Irish executives. Whatever the reasons, the business-government relations were of very different nature, and I think this played in the end in explaining some of the effects for the costs of the bailouts in these two cases. How am I doing on time? Good, okay. Then I will spend as much on the other cases as well. Now, coming to the coordinated bank-based economies, France and Germany, we see a little bit of the same pattern. To make it short, France the industry acted collectively and provided mechanisms which made the French government look quite good and come out well of the bailout, whereas the German industry, despite all you know about German corporatism, coordination, and everything else, failed in establishing something effective in this particular case in finance, and that explains to me why today costs are so high and why the why the setup is in the end quite centered on government initiative. So the conclusion, as I walk you through the case study here, is also that the pure socio-economic structure doesn't tell us enough. It tells us certainly what governments try to do with their industry, but it failed in this case, and we need to understand why it failed. So both countries, France and Germany, even though today people say, oh, but France wasn't affected in the same way that Germany was affected, I think that's wrong. I think in France there are a lot of signs, a lot of indicators that the financial crisis would hit with some force. BNP Paribas was already doing quite poorly in 2007 and was actually the first bank that brought a liquidity freeze to Europe. Société Générale had a scandal with a rogue investor losing 4 billion, the famous Jérôme Carriel case, and other investment banks were doing poorly as well. So the exposure was important, even though I don't dispute the arguments about the different types of banking systems that you have between the two countries, of people like David Howarth and Ian Hardy, for example. But then the crisis was imminent in both. Germany had the first bank failure of the financial crisis, but with the EKB going down, and had a lot of troubles in the Landesbanken, other cases that would become evident later on. But basically both were feeling the pressure, and both committed considerable amounts of their GDP, so 25% for Germany, 18% for France, of which they spent substantial portions, still 6% and 10% of GDP is not nothing. But the business-government relationships between them were quite different, and this will help me to make not an argument about costs, but an argument about the way in which the government in the end was forced to design the packages that they made available to their bank. So let me start again with the collective case first. France did a very collective arrangement, and a study by Nicolas Japko and Elsa Massoc, at one point this was in a revise and resubmit stage, they called it the French cartel, or the French finance cartel. And that gives you a good sense of what it is. Everybody was basically in a room smoking cigarettes and coming up with a joint plan that was supposed to be secretive. Their reviewers told them cartel is too connotated, you can't use that, it's really negative. So in the end they call it the French consortium, but that doesn't sound as nice. So I put cartel up here. So the business-government cartel is very intensive. You know how much in France political and economic elites are linked by joint schooling, by different educational tracks. A lot of bankers have worked in the public sector, a lot of public sector employees have worked in banks, and so on and so forth. Everybody's based in Paris, of course, and there are only very few concentrated banks. And so when the crisis hit, they coordinated very well and very quickly over the phone and in different meetings about plans of what to do. And they did two things. They first created a society called SFFE, Société du Financement de l'Économie Française. I don't know why the F is on the other, but it's SFEF. But that's the name, and it was supposed to be a public-private undertaking, but it was really quite private. both the government and the banks were partners in the way this société was set up, but it was backed by only private collateral, and the objective of the société was I'm stuck in French, to produce securities that could be bought on international markets with which liquidity would then be provided to the banking sector. So it was a way of pooling the strength of the French industry into one body, which could then gain liquidity on the international market. In the words of the Germans, this was hugely successful because it had government backing, so it was a reliable way to invest in the French financial sector. And the Germans at the same time did something similar. They had public backing, but individual banks trying to go on the market. And they said the fact that the French pooled them made them have a much better price. So the market was very much going on the French SFFE securities rather than the German ones because the price was so interesting. So that was a liquidity mechanism. And then the French government also put into place the Société de Participation dans Société SPPE, and oh no, I know, it's the SFEF, so the F does go on the other way, it's Économie Française, but it's SPPE, which was a way for the government to recapitalize companies, so buy equity in the French banks. This was entirely public funding, buying money, but the conditions with which this was applied was agreed to by all the banks. The banks negotiated the interest payment, for example, and they also agreed collectively that they would all take it. This is very similar, I will get to this, to TARP. TARP initially was much cited because all banks were recapitalized at the same time, and that's very important for the signal you send to financial markets, because it doesn't let the market know which are the banks that are in trouble and which are the ones that are not in trouble. So a collective recapitalization mechanism. And the outcome of all of this was, it was quite positive. They had a first round of a bailout package, which was in the middle of the crisis, probably one of the reasons why one of the big French banks, which was in trouble, did not have to come out and say we will go under and we have to be unwound. And in the second round of recapitalization, some of the French banks were even doing so well that they said we don't need to be part of this collective mechanism anymore. The government should stop supporting the banks because we're in better shape than what you think. So this means it was, first of all, an effective means to intervene at the time, and it was a very effective way to signal when government intervention should end. Because everything where the government just invests in the bank has an exit problem. Banks always find it nice to have this inflow of money, so they never stop saying that they're in trouble, and then you spend and spend and spend over time. So the collective solution in France was good for signaling exit and was good for showing a cohesive front at the time. In Germany, there was a similar type of negotiation. Every individual bank bailout, especially the early ones, the German government reacted in the same way. They called the representatives of the banking industry in a room and said, come up with a solution. How can you save your competitor? And the initial banks were actually saved with private money in a lot of cases, sometimes not sufficient amount of private money, but some. So very similar to the Danish example. But as time was going on, more and more banks failed, and this was becoming more and more expensive. And the German banking industry is very uneven. You have Deutsche Bank, which is huge. You have a lot of Sparkassen, which are tiny, and you have some in the middle. Any collective arrangement basically was a way of asking, can Deutsche Bank save IKB? Can Deutsche Bank save Dresdner? Can Deutsche Bank save HRE? And at one point, Deutsche Bank was just saying, hey, I'm not everybody's backstop. And basically, despite the attempts to do coordinated negotiations, the three pillars of the German banking sector did not want to show solidarity towards one another. The saving banks said, we will save ourselves, but we won't save the gamblers on the commercial bank side, and so on and so forth. So basically, it broke down among the three pillars. And then there was a collective plan that was negotiated, but with very uneven capacity on the banking side. The plan was announced, and some of you may remember that Josef Ackermann of Deutsche Bank then went on television and said, I would be ashamed to take the government's money. And at the time, Angela Merkel was furious because Josef Ackermann had, of course, been in the room and negotiated this plan that he then disavowed. So she said, how come he is there to signal to everybody we're doing something collective, and then said, ooh, I don't want to be part of this. I think it became the quotation of the year, according to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung this year, but it basically showed that the collectivity that was supposed to be engineered in Germany was very superficial and it broke down. And then the government had no other alternative than to come in and create unwinding companies, have a public fund to recapitalize and basically do it by themselves because of this breakdown. And the outcome is that the German bailout is rather expensive. And we haven't exited from it yet. Okay, a final word on liberal financial markets, so the United States and the United Kingdom. Why is this comparison not very helpful for me? Because I actually argue that in both cases we do not see a very strong collective element, neither in the UK nor in the United States. Now, I don't need to tell you the stories of the financial crisis and the bailouts in the United States and the United Kingdom. They're quite well known. The government committed was also very substantial. The main difference was in the nature of intervention, that the US government did try to have one moment of collectivity, which was this moment that's accounted in all stories of the financial crisis, where Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and the FDIC chief, Shayla Burr, called the major investment banks into a room and said, will you accept this government money? And when they said no, they said, you realize we can shut you down, and then they accepted it. But in order to accept mandatory recapitalization through TARP, the US strategy was to make money as cheap as possible. They really just basically threw the money at them and say, take it please, all of you, so the international financial markets will believe that all of you are stable and supported. And there's a famous citation of Citigroup CEO that said, let me just do the numbers on the back of an envelope, which is a little bit silly because you hear an interest rate, you know what it means, and then he says, wow, this is really cheap money. And so basically it was almost like a gift, people later said to the financial industry, and the financial industry said, okay, we'll take your gift, but we don't like it, but sure. And that was the collective element of TARP. It very quickly broke down because some banks repaid their money even way ahead of schedule, which sends the same signal, we didn't need it, other people needed it more. And it's also a very small element of the bank bailout package. TARP and the investment banks are, of course, just a small portion of everybody who's been saved and unwound through the FDIC, and it doesn't talk about automobiles either. Be that as it may, so the collectivity is not a very strong explanatory factor here. I then say something about the difference in the way, the strategies these two governments drove. Basically, to make it very simple, the United States had a strategy of making bailouts easy and favorable to the banking industry, so they basically gave them everything they want and had no punitive conditions with them, whereas the United Kingdom made it very, very hard. The United Kingdom had negotiations with their banking industry at one or two instances, and the government came out of this saying the bankers are just stupid, they don't realize their collective interest, they will not be a negotiating partner, so we will not consult them anymore, and we will impose on them what we think is the right thing to do, and they came down with very harsh conditions. They were not at all collective, they basically singled out the banks that were doing poorly. Quite punitive, it's a way of slapping you while you're being saved. And one of the banking representatives of the Royal Bank of Scotland called it a drive-by shooting. So just so you get a sense of the bailouts, the US was really cheap money and the UK was a drive-by shooting. That's how also you now see re-regulation. So in a way, the United States made the choice to forget about moral hazard, stabilize them first, make sure they're doing well, and then get paid back. Turns out that that was a winning strategy. Whereas the UK was trying to, in the moment in which they were saving them, maintain a moral hazard incentive system, which Culpeper argues this, was a very unsuccessful strategy because you're punishing and you're basically telling financial markets to not invest into this bank anymore, which is the one you have equity in, so the return on your equity will be very low because you've told everybody, please don't invest in this company. So you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. Be that as it may, you uphold moral hazard guidelines, so it's different choices, and it has very little to do with business-government relations, so I'll just add it on here as a case. Okay, so success and failure, you get a sense of where I'm going, but let me summarize. There was a collective element mainly in Denmark and France. There was an attempt to have collective elements in the United Kingdom and Germany, but they broke down. In the United States and Germany, but they broke down or they were disavowed. And in the end, I say something about government responses because the government strategy in response to the absence of a mobilization of the financial industry in the UK and the US was quite different and may tell us something. And this is just to drive home the point that the interaction between the government and the industry is quite important for us to understand what happened in the end. I'm focusing on the collective industry action, but if that's absent, then government strategy is a reaction to it and can also create quite diverse outcomes. So one take-home lesson is the institutional differences, at least these broad differences between socioeconomic structures, bank-based versus capital markets, or small open economy versus bigger economies, don't help us to explain the bailout dynamics. I think lobbying is too superficial about this whole notion of structural power, so I discard it as well. And inversely, the productive power of the finance industry, which is very high in all of these cases, doesn't help us to see government business strategies at any one point in time. So I think the key mechanism that I see best here is the collective willingness of the industry to engage and take over responsibility for their own failure. So conclusion, this collective action capacity and willingness is crucial for understanding government intervention, not just the moral hazard versus systemic risk debate. Now, please note that I put capacity and willingness, and/or willingness. Everybody always asks me, what is it? Does the banking industry decide not to intervene, or can they not intervene? And it's a bit of both. It's very hard to say, you're getting into an argument about false consciousness very quickly, or how do you detect preferences. They don't want to, for sure, because if they don't, then the government will. That's the gamble. And I call this actually, in the book, a giant game of chicken. What happens is that you have the economy is on the verge of collapsing. Somebody needs to act. The government needs to save the economy. The industry needs to save the economy. And the moment that I'm looking is the moment where you just need to understand who turns off the road first in order to avoid a crash. So, of course, everybody has an interest in saying, I just can't intervene in order to continue driving, and if that's credible, then they will win. And maybe it's true. Maybe sometimes they can't intervene. I think actually in the German it was an incapacity to intervene collectively because of the heterogeneity of the banking sector, despite all of the traditions of corporatist negotiations that were in place. I also see that in the Irish case, there was no fundamental structure in place that would have helped the industry to act collectively, but I also think they didn't want to. They just decided that individual strategies were more beneficial for them. So it's a mix of both. I don't have the means to distinguish between the two, so I just put them together. The sectors which succeeded then, if it's a conscious strategy, or but in any case, the sectors which remain collectively inactive impose the highest commitments on their governments and are also the bailouts that I think are most problematic, except for in the United States, where the way in which the bailout was designed, that was being quite favorable, and that's what it's very much criticized for, is also at least quite profitable. That said, how do you evaluate bailouts? If it's just in terms of cost, I would say the US was a success. But the other dimension that I've always discussed and did mention is moral hazard. I am very concerned about moral hazard in the US still today, because I think the US government has not resolved this difficulty of making a credible structure that says bailouts won't happen. They basically designed a bailout that was favorable. They made money with it. They designed a new regulation packages, Dodd-Frank in particular, that says no bailout in the future will ever use government money ever again, whatever the legal language is by which you say this. And I just think, who should believe this? Every banking crisis in the world has required governments to commit public funds. Why? Just because you write a law, would it be different? So I think in terms of moral hazard, the US do fare quite poorly, but in terms of benefits, they fare relatively well. And on back to power, I have a special situation because I have a situation in which action is needed. So we're already in a context of high structural power. We already have these two cars driving on towards the bridge. So somebody needs to act. And in a case where structural power is high and action is needed, the incapacity, the capacity to remain inactive is a crucial indicator for business power. And basically that's the drive home point I wanted to make. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.